we've got a beef herd of cattle, we've got pigs, we've got sheep, we've got laying hens, we've got table birds. We have dairy processing, so my wife makes the cheese and the yogurt on the farm. We've got a butchery on site. I noticed in your plans, there's plans for a brewery on site, which we haven't got one of those, unfortunately. Wish we had, but we grow a lot of arable. We supply a big local brewery with barley for malting. So it's a full holistic farm that produces pretty much anything we could grow in the country commercially. We try and produce, basically. So I've been a veg farmer for 15 years. Love it more and more every single year. It's a fantastic subject. Just gets bigger and bigger. The more you learn, the more there is to learn. Before that, I used to live in a lorry, travel around the countryside, working deep in the woodland, planting trees, doing a lot of harvesting of trees, basically essentially managing woodlands, making traditional charcoal, looking after hedges, all things tree-based. And I loved it. I did it for about 3 years, but there's no money in it. And then I had children. My wife said we needed more money, so I went back into mainstream farming, basically. But the lovely thing for me is that essentially trees were my first passion that I kind of had to give up because it didn't earn me enough money. So I moved into farming and learned all about veg production. And after 5 years of growing fruit and veg, I discovered this thing called agroforestry, which is dreamy to me because it basically combined my first love of trees with my new love of food production. And it seamlessly molded, I think the only 2 skill bases I've ever had in my life suddenly became 1 skill base, which is great, which is perfect for me. So the question of what is agroforestry? There's a lot of things bandied around as agroforestry, but I mean, it's a very wide envelope. In really simple terms, it is integrating trees into farming practices. And that might be designing a whole new system like it looks like you guys will do at some point, and design a system from scratch as an integrated food production and tree growing system. Or it might be that you introduce them into an existing system already. Okay, and there's lots of versions. So you have something called silver pasture. So that is where you integrate livestock production with trees, and there's lots of benefits of that. So for things like cattle, it's protection from the cold, the wind, protection from the sun with shade. For things like chickens, it's their natural habitat. Chickens are jungle birds naturally. So if you have chickens in England, their favorite habitat is woodland. Pigs are a woodland animal, essentially. We farm them in big fields in the UK, but where they want to be is under trees in the shade, rooting around looking for acorns and nuts and stuff like that. Possibly, I mean, silver pasture is probably the fastest take up of agroforestry in this country at the moment because it doesn't have that massive an impact on your existing production systems, because essentially your livestock move around a field. The one limiting factor is you have to cut the grass. As long as your trees aren't too randomly positioned that they get in the way of cutting your grass or cutting for silage and hay, then it's quite an easy system to bring in. The other big agroforestry that happens in this country and is gaining pace very quickly is silver arable. So that is grain crops intermixed with trees. The one I'm going to talk about, my reference point as a horticulturalist, is going to be about silver horticulture. So that's mixing fruit and veg crops with trees. And then just to show that it goes right across the board, the bottom left-hand picture on the screen, that is mushroom production with trees. Now, obviously, mushrooms like growing in woodlands, they like growing in the shade. So if you can grow them in a woodland, you're growing them in the perfect place, which is exactly what this is. So these are loads of impregnated logs with shiitake mushrooms, and they're just put under the trees because it's the perfect environment. It's not a new thing. Agroforestry is ancient. It's thousands of years old. There's continuous agroforestry systems in China that have been growing arable crops under trees for over 1,000 years continuously. So it's not a new trendy thing. Like a lot of sustainable farming, it's something we've been doing for years and years and years, and everyone forgot about it when the chemicals turned up. Now that we're not going to be able to afford the chemicals, we've realized they're destroying the planet, we're going to go back to looking at these, I say old techniques, but they've been constantly modernized by the people who've kept doing them. So they're very old fashioned, but they're very up to date. And in fact, they're probably the most cutting edge part of agriculture at the moment, I think, is probably agroforestry. And whatever farm you're on in the country, whether you're conventional, organic, regenerative, everybody's looking at how they can integrate trees into their farms, basically. So why integrate trees onto your farm? So like I said, there's a lot of noise around agroforestry and lots of farmers talking about agroforestry and wanting to get grant money for doing agroforestry. But it's almost one of those things where it's become a bit trendy. So lots of farmers are starting to do it because it's what everyone else is doing. And the thing they learn almost once they make that decision is actually there's so many benefits to adding trees to your existing crops, basically. So we've got we've got benefits of the benefits of trees directly to your existing crops. So actually putting trees in amongst your crops can make your crops perform better, and I'll talk about that a little bit. You've got the potential of crops from trees. So there's loads of versions of that we'll have a little bit of a look at. Adapting to and mitigating climate change. Trees play a huge role in doing this. They're a really, really key tool for helping us in these crazy weather times. Specific benefits in urban environments. So I don't know if we've got any urban market gardeners here. We're close enough we might have thought. But yeah, they're just as an important tool in an urban environment as they are in a rural environment. Social benefits of trees, and then reversing biodiversity collapse. So I think we're going to look at some of those in a little bit more depth. So the benefits for existing crops. So, and especially, you know, there's a lot of crossover here with mitigation and adapting to climate change, basically. So these things are just great generally with farming, and they're really good things to manage in a positive way for your crops, and farmers do all the time. But all of these things are becoming a lot harder or a lot more important to manage as climate change really starts to kick in. You know, as farmers, climate change kicked in about 10 years ago. You know, the weather went crazy. Our 4-season years and my old cropping plans that I used to just repeat every year, they've been ripped up, burnt, rewritten, redesigned every year for 10 years now, as we try and work out what is the new pattern with climate change. Basically, there isn't one. Everything is just much more intense. And trees can help us manage these much more intense conditions really, really well. So wind is a big one, especially where I am. I'm not sure about how your climate is up here, but like it's definitely wind everywhere, whether it be during droughts in the summer and getting strong winds that are drying out the ground and drying out the crops, or more commonly in the storms we're now getting in the winters and in the springs are getting more and more intense. Now, vegetable crops, even arable crops, even livestock don't like being battered by wind and rain all day long, especially if it's got a wind chill of -2. No crops, no animals, maybe emperor penguins like that, but nothing else really likes that. So just by planting trees around your crops and creating wind breaks, you're going to immediately benefit your crops as we look at future climate. By dropping wind speeds, you drop evaporation rates in your cropping area, so you're using less water, very relevant in a summer like this year. You also, by dropping winds, you increase temperatures. You create microclimates, basically, by dropping that, by removing the wind chill. So you can actually bump temperatures up by 1 degree, 2 degrees, which in the summer is not a massive deal. In fact, these days you're trying to drop temperatures in the summer. But when you go in the spring and you try and produce your very first crops of the year, it's the wind chill that drops the temperature by a couple of degrees that really can put a bit of a slow start to your growing season. So any way you can drop the winds can bring massive benefits to your crops, to your arable crops, or to your livestock. The next one to talk about is water. Now, like I said, with weather changing now, rain, I mean, I crave old English drizzle. It just doesn't seem to happen anymore. It's either raining like it's the monsoon, or it's just dry. That's what we've had on our farm this year. And when it rains like a monsoon, again, that can be really damaging for crops. Just the physical force of the water can flatten crops, but more dangerous is actual flooding and submerging of crops. It does not take very long, 2 days for a veg crop to be in standing water, and you've pretty much lost it. It might not die, but it'll be covered in slugs. When it does dry out, it'll probably be covered in mold. Weight of water is a really heavy substance. If you get standing water in your field, it squashes your soil really badly. And that happens a little bit every winter, but in the middle of the growing season, that can have a massive negative impact on your crops. And if you look at the picture of the tree where it says water, underneath that tree, that rooting system, I don't know if there's any builders or architects in them, that is essentially nature's soak away. Okay, so when you build a house, you need your drainage to go somewhere, you dig a big pit and you fill it with stones, and the water goes in there and seeps out into the ground. Now, trees are natural soakaways. This big root mass under that tree will fracture the soil and keep it open at all times. The more trees you have, the more drainage devices you have in your field, basically. So with these intense rainstorms, trees let that water quickly percolate into the soil and drain away, so it's not damaging your crops. The other end of the scale, we've got shade. So I think definitely this year is the first year. We've had heat waves before. We've had, you know, temperatures quite close to it. We had 37 on the farm this year in the shade. That was 37 degrees. I'll tell you that a potato crop suffers heat stress at 15 degrees centigrade, and its performance drops with every centigrade above 15 degrees. When you're at 37 degrees centigrade, your potato crop, no matter how much water I give my potato crop, irrigation-wise, the sheer temperature will affect it negatively. So I think it's a part of agroforestry that more and more is becoming, that we've already put our system in, but the benefits of shade I'm seeing being a more and more important tool with agroforestry. And that is literally to drop the temperatures in the cropping areas, basically make it more comfortable for the crops. The important thing about shade is obviously with in the UK climate, if we get really hot summers, we want some shade out to cover the trees, but we have huge day length difference in this country. So one of the biggest problems of growing fruit and vegetable crops in the UK outside of British summer is day length. It's a really defining factor. So one thing you don't want to do is put your crops in the shade all year round. You don't really want your crops in the shade in the winter, probably not in the spring and the autumn either, which is why, especially with horticultural crops, it's deciduous trees we use. So trees that only come out in leaf in the summer. And if you get clever about it, you can pick trees that either come out in leaf late or come out in leaf early, and you can get really involved with which trees you pick. And then the other really big, and this is, whatever you're doing, trees bring this benefit all the time. Soil health is probably the most important thing for producing crops, whether they be horticultural, arable. It's also critically important in producing healthy meat products from livestock as well. You know, everything the cows eat and the chickens eat grows out of the soil. That plant they're eating will be the content and nutrient content of that plant will be defined by the soil it grows in. Now, the role trees can play for soil health is they've got a massive rooting system. They have loads of what's called symbiotic relationships with funguses and soil life underground. Their impact on soil life, they're such big organisms, trees, that they have a huge boosting effect on soil life. And then that just has a knock-on health benefit for the soil around your crops as well. The other key techniques, if you look at the picture where it says soil health here, those two lines of trees, so the roots from those trees probably meet underneath that crop of sweet corn. Okay, and if you're doing agroforestry right, they should go down below the roots of that sweet corn crop and then meet like that. Even if the roots don't meet, the fungus that is living around the roots will definitely meet. And what that creates is essentially a safety net or catch net for nutrients. Now, one of the most important nutrients in this example is nitrogen. So nitrogen is, I always describe it as like petrol for plants. It is the really simple way of viewing it. It's the nutrient that produces all the proteins in plants that allow them to build themselves and grow and become lovely big plants. It's highly soluble. Whatever form you put it in, there are many different conventional forms, so artificial fertilizer, but even sustainable forms of nitrogen like cover crops and compost, nitrogen is soluble. It's very soluble. So one of the big problems with veg growers is most vegetable plants are about 30 centimeters of rooting depth, and then nothing underneath that. One big rainstorm, and it can dissolve all your nitrogen, your critical nutrients, and it will just wash straight down past the roots of your plants, and potentially either be lost to your crops forever, but also potentially end up in waterways and cause pollution. Is a big challenge for farmers at the moment. What the trees do is this safety net underneath is if the nitrogen washes past your plants, the trees pick it up, take it on the roots, or if the roots haven't met under the crops, the fungus will pick it up, take it to the sides, feed it to the trees. The trees will want to take the nitrogen up into the leaves above your crops. Then in the autumn, they drop all the leaves on the floor, and they've brought that nitrogen, which you've lost past your crops, back up to the top, and just put it nicely on the top in a quite a stable organic matter form, which will then slowly rot down and release the nitrogen again. So you're creating a cycle for your nutrients and a safety net, basically. And then we've got trees. Trees is crops, so trees or crops from trees. So the obvious one with trees is timber, and that can take many forms. For farmers, you know, that might be just timber for your own farm. So that might be fencing materials, that might be making gates, that might be putting up new barns or pack sheds or building breweries, depending on whatever you want to do on your farm. But every farm uses a lot of wood. So timber on its own is a critically useful crop for farmers. You've then got edible crops. So nut crops, top fruit crops as we call them. So fruit crops, so apples, pears, cherries, that sort of stuff. And then flower crops, so elderflower for making drinks. The list of edible crops and trees goes on, basically. And then also, I like to pop this slide in because trees are. So I always put this slide in because it can be, you can just end up as a farmer just thinking that your only role is to produce food, and that's it. And most farmers, that is their primary role. But once you bring trees into the production area or onto your farm as a crop, all sorts of other avenues open up. Trees are in the ground for a long time. Some timber trees are not ready to harvest for 100 years. So quite often with agroforestry systems, you're not planting it for yourself. You are essentially planting it for society, or planting it if it's your own personal family farm, you might be planting it for your kids or for your grandkids. Apple trees will start cropping in 10 years. Walnuts is a much, much longer project. However, it's important to think forward and think about the future. So the 3 examples I've got here, one is microfibrillated cellulose. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that is essentially where they extract cellulose from wood, and it's being looked as the future for plastic. So basically, biodegradable packaging, possibly medicinal plastic that you're looking to use it for. So that's a future project. I mean, that's already being developed now, so it's not that far in the future. Cross-laminated timber, so the high-rise building in the middle of the picture, that whole building is built out of timber. Even what would have used to have been the steel RSJ, so all the steel superstructure, that is actually just done with laminated timber in that building. And it is, although there's inherent fire risks, obviously, it is being looked as the way forward. Like the steel industry is massively carbon heavy. So something's going to have to happen with the steel industry. Either it'll have to decarbonize from clever science, or we'll have to use other substances instead of steel. And wood is what we used to use before we had steel, essentially. And then biodegradable electronics. So again, that is all the plastic components in microchips are now in Japan. They are already producing biodegradable microchips, and that is being made from wood. So there's some nice future examples of what we can do with wood, with trees. And then, offset effects of climate change. So I talked a little bit about this earlier, but you can see, that sweet corn, luckily that's not my sweet corn, I have to say. But I bet there are crops of sweet corn around this country like that. We had some big storms just before we started cropping our sweet corn. We were all right. We didn't get them too bad. I know some people did lose sweet corn. Just dropping that wind speed. So like I said, there's loads of benefits to your crops, but the number one benefit of dropping the wind speed is stopping that from happening when you get a massive gale in the middle of the summer. And the other benefits all coming as well. And then I talked about trees and how they manage water. So if you look at all that, I'd say all that water rushing out that gateway past that tree, well, it's probably about 50% water and 50% topsoil there. And topsoil takes thousands and thousands of years to make. So we need to keep it in the fields. And if you look at that picture, the only place where that topsoil is washing off that field is where there's not a tree. So where the hedges are coming down that road, there's no topsoil flowing off the fields. And in fact, it's just because they've put a gap in the hedge so they get tractors in and out that all the topsoil is washing out the field. So it's a really good example how trees can manage dangerous soil erosion that is definitely a bigger factor with climate change. And again, I also talked about the ability of trees both to slow down water. So this has been talked a lot outside of agroforestry. So stopping the major urban flooding we're getting these days by slowing the water down upstream. And that is the best way of doing that is getting trees in as much as possible, letting the rivers overflow a bit more and all that sort of stuff. But we talked about the soak-away effect of trees, and that's going to be a crucial thing going forward. Urban benefits of trees. So they're really, it's really obvious in this picture, visual barrier. Without the trees, that's a very different little market garden in a city, isn't it? That's a market garden with everyone watching you from their windows. As soon as you put the trees up, a lot of people get involved in horticulture in the city because it's a lovely green island away from the madness of the city. And anything you can do to add to that sense of seclusion, and trees are a fantastic way of doing that. They're also great as a noise barrier. Cities are noisy places, trees absorb sound, and they create that nice sort of safe space effect in a city. Storm runoff. Yeah, it's exactly like I said before, in the farmers' fields, trees, well, A, they'll stop all that water running off all those city streets, the downpour, into the market garden and ruining your crops, but they are also an important tool for managing water within cities as well. Yeah, critical islands of habitat. One tree on its own is an unbelievably complex wildlife habitat. So sticking an unbelievably complex wildlife habitat in the middle of a city where, you know, habitat is few and far between. Every time you put a tree in a city, you're doing a wonderful thing, and you're providing a haven for wildlife that is managing to survive there. And again, shade in an ever-warming climate. And that's not just shade for your crops, that is shade for your workers as well. Which leads me on to social benefits of trees. So trees have been meeting places for ever since, you know, humans have evolved. Trees have been meeting places. You know, whether it be pilgrims traveling across Europe, hiding under yew trees to stay out of the rain, or whether it be, you know, in Old English culture, yew trees are a pagan symbol, and they used to be meeting points for villages. All used to go meet under yew trees, and that is because they provide great rain cover and they provide food all year round, so they're evergreen. The other great ones I really like about the social benefits of trees is, you know, we do have a tiny bit of it in our culture, which feels like it might just be about to be lost. But if you go to Spain, the olive harvest is a community activity, and the whole village goes out and harvests the olives. You go to France, the elderflower harvest is a community activity. In some places in France, the whole village goes out, they all harvest elderflowers, they bring them back, they make them into drinks, they sell them all over France, and the money that the community makes from that funds their school, funds their sports halls, funds their swimming pools. So they're a really great tool for like social cohesion. And they have been meeting points for people for a long, long time. And the UK version is apples, without a doubt. I'm a Somerset lad at heart, and that is just solid cider orchards. And it is, whether it be wassail, pruning, or harvest, it's apples that bring communities together in Somerset. You know, and it's very much those tree crops. And they've got their very important role to play socially. Reversing decline in biodiversity. So this beautiful great big oak tree here, oak trees, there are 230 species of animal that critically rely on an oak tree to complete their life cycle. Without oak trees, 230 species would die out immediately because they have to have oak trees. And whichever tree you look at, the oak tree is probably the most complex ecosystem and serves the most species for their life cycles. But every single tree has specific wildlife, whether it be mammal, bird, or insect, or fungus, that critically relies on it to complete its life cycle. And then there's loads of generalists that use loads of trees, but must have trees in their life cycles. And the really important thing, I always say, is not very often, everyone thinks about reversing biodiversity decline as being some sort of charitable exercise. For me as a veg farmer, it is far from that. It's almost like, for me as a veg farmer, this role of biodiversity is the one that I'm most interested in and is the most important thing to me. And the fact that it happens to be really good for loads of other things in society is a massive bonus. It's a win-win-win-win. So if you just look at some of those facts there, you know, ladybirds, one ladybird laid 5,000 aphids in its lifetime and laid 300 eggs. You sort of extrapolate that maths out, ladybirds eat a lot of aphids in a season. Trees are where ladybirds go in the winter. So when the rains start coming, the winds start coming, ladybirds don't want to be out of that. So they all either disappear to the woodlands, the hedges, or just to the nearest tree, and they'll find a dead leaf, curled up dead leaf to hide in for the winter, or they'll hide in the bark of the tree for the winter, then come back out the next spring and protect my crops by eating aphids. Blue tits. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. So that's one blue tit chick in a nest can eat 100 caterpillars in a day, 10 chicks in a nest. So that's 1,000 caterpillars a day. So anyone who's ever tried to grow a cabbage, a cauliflower, or broccoli, and that thing completely stripped by cabbage white butterflies, the birds are your friends. You know, you really want to. And the number one way of attracting birds into a growing area is sticking loads of trees in there. And then the last one, but possibly the most important one for anyone who's ever tried to grow lettuce, is 1 in 4 animals in the world is a beetle. Beetles love eating slugs, and they love eating slug eggs. And again, loads of beetles, they need the trees themselves to complete their life cycles, or the litter and the leaf and the rotting wood that drops at the bottom of trees is a critical part of where they complete their life cycles. And we want, like I said, none of this for me is a charitable exercise. It's a really competitive part of my sustainable farming, is to farm wildlife at the same time, and it pays me back. It's not something that I gently nurture on the side. I put as much emphasis and effort into farming insects in my cropping areas as I do to looking after my soil or growing really healthy crops. They're all intrinsically linked, basically. So yeah, so there's all these benefits to having trees on your farms. And so you're going to look about what trees on farms. How are we going to get trees on farms? Okay, so essentially it's really important to look at what trees are already on the farm. Before you start to do loads of tree planting, you've probably got loads of important tree assets on your farm already. So lone trees, you look at these huge, massive arable fields, and they, for some reason, I quite like it. They've wiped out every tree for miles around, and then kind of at the last minute had a pang of guilt and left one huge, beautiful oak tree. Which is, I love that. I love the fact that at some point it kicked in. They went, I can't cut down every tree. And they leave one. Ironically, those lone trees, it becomes such an important island of habitat, especially on conventional farms, where if you're down the ground in a conventional crop, you're probably going to get sprayed or driven over. You want to be up in that tree, and not to live in, but as islands for birds moving across the landscape. They're absolutely crucial, and almost all of those will have a fox or a badger living underneath them somewhere. Hedgerows, we're very lucky in the UK. There's hedgerows everywhere. They're, again, an amazing asset. If you have hedgerows on your bit of land or in your garden, nurture them with everything you've got. They are our wildlife motorways. They will bring all the beneficial animals and insects onto your farms and into your cropping areas. If you're lucky enough to have any woodland on your farm, nurture that. I mean, that is like, in terms of, that is ground zero of complex habitats. So if you've got farmland everywhere, it's the little copses and the woodlands where everything lives. They live there, they come out and they wander across the farmland and eat stuff and go about their daily lives, but they'll always go back to that woodland. So if you can expand those woodlands, or if you can link the woodlands up with hedgerows, or if there's a woodland off the farm, if you can get a hedgerow that goes from that woodland to your farm, you should kind of look at aerial maps, understand the tree landscape around your farm and how you can make it work for you. And then last but by no means least, there's integrating crops integrating trees right in amongst your crops, so agroforestry. But if you're going to do this, if you're going to do agroforestry, it's quite important to design it. It's really important to design it, especially with vegetable crops, because efficient vegetable production is, I always call it, it's a systems thing. When I farm vegetables, I don't think of any of my behaviours in isolation. So I don't sit down and come up with my irrigation plan for the year, put that over there, and then come up with my fertility plan for the year, put that over there, come up with how am I going to keep the slugs off my lettuce plan and put that there. All of it interacts. So as that example, one of the most important ways to manage slugs in a horticultural system is to manage your irrigation really intelligently. When and how long you do it for, and if you need to do it, is probably the most important way of managing slugs. But it's like that with everything on the farm. So if you're going to bring trees onto your farm, it's really important you do it with some intelligence and some design. So like I said here, right tree, right place. There's loads of trees, there's loads of places on your farm you can put them. Not all of them are going to work. So you want to get to know your trees and make sure you plant the ones that you want and in the right place. Plan well once, this could be there for 1,000 years. That's a bit, I'm not very good at this, but it's a little bit like measure twice, cut once. I'm terrible. I'm really bad at measuring twice, but I am quite good at thinking about where I put my trees. So I should apply that to my carpentry skills as well. Access expertise where required. So I'll come on to that a bit when I talk about the system we put on our own farm. So many options, don't get carried away. So it's a little bit like, there's any growers here. It's like you sit down at Christmas with the seed catalogue, and it's like the adult version of being a kid in a sweet shop. And I don't want to buy every colour of radish, and I'll buy every colour of courgette. And then suddenly it all arrives, and I realize, oh my God, the boss doesn't know any of this stuff. It's the same with trees. There's so many to choose from that you just don't get carried away. You don't have to have, every tree does not have to be different. In fact, a well-managed system will probably be less variety and well thought out variety, basically. And this is the most important question. It goes back to farmers wanting to take up agroforestry just because it's a trendy thing at the moment. And this is the thing I always get people to realise is to ask the question, what does your farm need that the trees can provide? Every single farm is unique. You know, a little bit like the land agent said, you know, look for, they're all different, the farms. And like, if we won't find a 10 out of 10, you might find a 7 out of 10, but you might find that you knock it up to an 8 or a 9 out of 10 by how you integrate trees into the cropping system. You know, whether that be trees on a slope to stop soil erosion, whether that be trees if you're on a floodplain. You know, these are all things that might come up as possible 7 out of 10s. I'm looking for a bit of land, but trees might well be a really good tool for offsetting and bringing you up to an 8 or a 9. So, designing an agroforestry system. The questions you want to ask yourself is, what do I want to achieve? You know, what do I want for my trees? Do I want to cut down wind speed? Do I want to recycle my nutrients from under my crops? For a lot of people, it is just, I want to grow more crops in the same space. So essentially start cropping in a 3-dimensional manner. So you're cropping on the ground and you're cropping above as well. And quite often that is the biggest desire from people getting into agroforestry. What trees deliver this objective? There's no point in planting a pine tree if you want an apple crop. You know, it's pretty obvious. So, like, you know, you pick what you want to achieve, and then you start to look at the trees that will give you this end objective. What trees suit my site? You know, if you're at altitude, not all trees like growing at altitude. If you're on the coast, not all trees like growing on the coast. If you're in a really wet field, some trees hate being in really, really wet land. Some trees love being in really, really wet land. So understand your site and its seasonal requirements and match your trees to that. And this is very important. How will trees interact with my crops on the ground? So there are lots of positive interactions between trees and crops. There are also negative interactions. You know, a sweet corn plant on the north side of a tree, 2 meters away from it, won't be a very good sweet corn plant because it will be in full shade all day long. So I talked about how shade is a useful thing, but if it's in the right place and it's managed correctly. Not all vegetable crops will want to be in the shade all the time. So the way we quite often manage it with veg crops is the trees are planted in a north-south direction, and that means that all of the vegetables either side of the trees get at least half a day's sunshine because the sun passes over either side of the trees. If you put your trees in the east-west direction, the crops just to the north of the line will be getting very, very little sunshine. You can do it that way, but if you do it that way, you tend to spread your trees out a little bit wider, basically. So yeah, just like a bit of foresight and how the pros and cons of trees to the crops might just mean you put a bit of space, a bit more space between the trees and the crops. But it's definitely something you need to think about. Choosing your trees. So soil type. Not all trees grow on all soil types. Where I am, we're on a very high pH, so we're a pH of about 8. So for me, trees that are out of the question were sweet chestnut, doesn't like high pHs. Annoyingly, because actually I'm quite into future-proofing climate change when I do tree planting. So annoyingly for us, citrus does not like being on a high pH, it likes acidic soils. If I'd be on a more neutral or acidic soil, I would definitely apply citrus. It wouldn't have cropped for 5 or 6 years. But if we start getting summer temperatures of 35 degrees and frosts are a thing of the past, which is a possibility looking into the future of climate, then we're looking at new crops. We're looking at olives, we're looking at almonds, we're looking at citrus. Tiny little positive points of climate change. You've got to grab the positives where they are, you know. Climate's very important. So like I said, I get very late frosts and we're up on the Cotswold Plateau, we get late frosts and early frosts. I'd love to grow peaches and nectarines and apricots. No chance. At the moment, the blossom will get wiped out every single year. So like I said, if I planted those, they might be a bit of a future planting, but for commercial production right now, I avoid things that blossom early for edible crops because we get a late frost that kills them all off. End product, so obviously, like I said, you need to pick the right tree for the right end product. Growth habit. So especially if you're integrating it with vegetable crops, the size, so the actual height of the tree, therefore the amount of shade it will cast, the speed it grows. For example, willow will grow up to, like, some willows will grow to 10 foot in a couple of years. So you've got to work out how you're going to manage something like that if it's going to be a crop. And then the spread of the trees. So again, if it's a very wide spreading trees, and I've got some apple trees that are quite wide spreading, and we need to do some quite creative pruning. Otherwise, I'm going to start hitting them with a tractor when I go down the vegetable crops. So you just got to visualize what the trees are going to look like around your crops when they're mature. Rooting habit. So not many people realize this, but with most agroforestry systems, what you need to do is you need to push the roots of the tree down below your vegetable crops. Vegetable crops don't like having tree roots growing straight in amongst them. In fact, it robs them of water. Some trees can produce tannin to suppress the growth of other plants around them. So you've got to take, and the way that's done is something called root pruning. So for me, on a large scale, I do that with a tractor. And if that is ground level there, we'll keep it on the camera as well. Basically, tree roots go into the ground, and they'll go, depending on the type of tree, but most people put deep roots down, and they'll put shallow roots across as well. Deep roots find nutrient and water in droughts. Shallow roots will get water when it's a very light shower, and they'll find other nutrients up near the surface. We don't want those water roots in amongst our crops because they'll rob the water. So what we do is we do what's called root pruning. We just do it with a plough, but we basically, at least once every 4 years, we cut all the roots of the tree down to about 30 centimeters. What that does is the tree eventually gives up trying to put roots out 30 centimeters and just keeps putting them out below. And then that creates that safety net we were talking about earlier. But it's something not many people think about. I think because in silver pasture, it doesn't matter. So if the tree roots go out underneath the grass, it's not a big deal. So it's not something that's talked about much. It's very, very particular with horticultural cropping because trees can easily outcompete a lettuce, basically. Okay, next. Design the layout. I love this. I came across this photo recently. So this is a lavender farm in France, and it all looks like that. The whole farm, it's just beautiful. Apples, pears, cherries, and lavender everywhere. Must smell amazing. So aspects, I talked about this. If you're going to have lines of trees, if you have lines of trees, it's called alley cropping. And I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but with horticulture, normally you do alley cropping. So you grow your crops in this strip, then you grow your trees in this strip, then you grow your crops in this strip. The widths of those alleys can change. But as far as aspect is concerned, whether your alleys point north, south, or east, west, and they can point any points to the compass. The things that will define that, or you have to take into account, one is sunlight and shade. So like I said, if you're going east-west, you're creating a big bit of permanent shade on the other side. Now, there are some things that like growing in shade that you might want to create shade for. But generally, if you can, most people go north-south to get equal shade across your crops. The other thing about aspect is if you're putting in a tree system and your main aim is wind protection, you might ignore the north-south because you might want to put it across the prevailing wind, especially if you're coastal. That might be your main reason for putting in the trees. So there's different aspects for different end results. Rotation. So, you know, a lot of horticultural operations will have a rotation. Definitely for me, when we put in our system, a lot of people when they put in the systems, they use tree lines just to demarcate the rotation areas. It's a really natural way of doing it. So I've got a 5-year rotation in the field of agroforestry, and every year, every separate crop area, it's just got 2 lines of trees down the outside. And it's just a natural way of demarcating things. And the other thing with rotation, if you're going to crop trees, I'll come on to this a little bit in the later, you can crop them in sync with your rotation. So that when you cut down a tree, you'll create a lot of shade and light, a lot of light, and take away the shade for a year. And that will slowly go more shady over the next 3 to 5 years. But you can, I'll talk about this a bit later, you can integrate that into your system and use it to your advantage. Root management. So that's the root pruning I was talking about. You need to keep the roots below your crops, basically. Protection, everything wants to eat trees. Voles, squirrels, deer, they all have a bite at them. So you have to know what wildlife's around that might want to eat trees when you plant it. Then you've got to think about how you're going to protect it. That might be fencing the whole field. You know, a lot of horticulture operations rabbit-proof their fields anyway. So it might be just putting a few extra wires on top to keep deer out. Even with that, quite often people use spiral guards and tree tubes or electric fences to keep wildlife away from trees. And then the last thing now, which I talk about, is systems approach. So I'll just give one example of what I mean by this, because it's maybe not that self-explanatory, but the way we designed our system, I'll show you in a minute, is when we water the vegetable crops, it automatically waters the trees at the same time. So I haven't created myself any extra work for watering those trees. I haven't got to go out in the morning and go, I'm going to water all the vegetable crops, and then in the afternoon go, oh, we're in the drought, I'm going to go and water all the tree crops now. It's all done in the same activity. So it's important to try and, to integrate the tree system into your existing farming system, your planned farming system seamlessly. So it's just another crop that can be farmed with all your existing equipment. Okay, so I think that was a more general look at agroforestry and the pros and cons of designing a system. Those principles of designing a system that I've just talked about, I'm now going to apply, and I'm going to talk through the same design principles, but how we applied them to the farm where I work. Okay, so we're going to look at the system at the farm where I work. Our main reason for putting in trees on the farms, like I said, you know, trees are great, full stop, but you've got to ask what they can do for you. Now, we've got a big farm shop on site. We're organic. I grow a lot of horticultural crops. My first reason for putting in trees for me was horticultural benefits. It wasn't increased crops. It wasn't capture carbon, or I think that's a complicated subject actually. Carbon is a cycle. So trees don't capture carbon forever. When the tree dies, it releases the carbon. So it might be a short-term solution for capturing carbon now, but we just got to stop producing so much CO2 basically. Trees are a little tool, but be careful. We didn't plant trees for that reason. For us, we're a windy site, very windy. We've got wind turbines in the same field as the agroforestry. So the biggest one for me was, like I talked about, was reducing wind speeds. That will save me water, and it will pick my temperatures up in my growing areas, help me grow better and more crops, basically. Recycling nutrients is a big one as well. We're quite a free draining soil. So if stuff's going to leach away, it's going to leach away fast. So that safety net I was talking about underneath the crops, I was very interested in. And provide shade as well. So yeah, and that I've added that. I didn't used to have that on the slide. I've added that because I realised after this summer we had 2 bouts of high 30s, and it's just intense, both for workers and for the crops. And it's very commercially threatening, those temperatures to a vegetable farm. So the shade aspect is more and more the most important thing for me. It has survived, yeah. We all look like sun-dried tomatoes. We feel like sun-dried tomatoes. And I love that. I'm loving the fact that autumn is here. Honestly, it is really intense weather. Not to pull any punches, it's scary. You know, the only reason we survived is very luckily a long time ago. So we've been organically farmed for 30 years. I've been there 8, but it's been going for 30. 25 years ago, they put in an amazing irrigation system, very over-spec'd for the vegetable garden. That system now is, I'd say, slightly under-spec'd. It would have cost 25 years ago, probably cost them 12,000. Now it probably cost them about 60, 70,000 to put in. So I'm incredibly fortunate, and it's the difference between, it's the best yields I've ever had. But that is simply because of irrigation. And a lot of other vegetable farmers all around the country have had massive, massive problems. Massive. I think there's 50% down on the UK potato yield for this year. 30% of the UK potato crop was ploughed in July because it wasn't worth carrying on. And that's just me. Like I said, 15 degrees centigrade is their optimum temperature. So yeah, it's tricky times. Very possible. Potato farms require an insane amount of water, absolutely vast amounts of water. So either they need to look at everything they're doing around managing water supply for those crops. But I think because not everyone's going to be able to sort out the water situation. So I actually think a lot of people will move crops. and a lot of the talk in the veg world at the moment is how can we perennialise everything. The best looking crop on my farm this year, which didn't need anything like the amount of water as everything else, was the apples. The apples have been fantastic. And I think you can tell the apples are slightly smaller than they should be, but perennials survive drought much better than annuals. And most vegetable crops are annuals. So we want to avoid all these horticultural benefits and just planting trees, which is going to drop wind speeds, recycle nutrients. But we're a big farm shop. We try and produce as much of the stuff we sell ourselves as possible. So a big thing for us was to increase our range of crops through trees. The obvious one for us, I mean, we've got a few apple trees. We had a few apple trees and a few plum trees around the farm, but nothing major. Again, because we're high and we get late frosts, we're not a commercial orchard area really. But I think it's one big problems. It's like we've compartmentalized our agriculture. We only grow stuff around the country where it's absolutely perfect to grow that stuff. For vegetables, that means 85% of our vegetables are grown on peat in the east of England. We now realise that's really bad and releasing loads of CO2. So actually, I think for me, what I'm passionate about, and the project that you're involved in is a similar thing, is everywhere needs to be producing food, and everywhere needs to be trying to produce all the food for all its community, whether it be arable, meat or vegetable or fruit. I think we need loads more mixed farm. We need food production of all of this stuff all around the country, basically. I think it's really important for employment and social reasons as well as just producing the food. So yeah, so we put in loads. We put in 100 apple trees, about 30 pear trees, and about 10 plum trees. The other thing we buy, so we used to buy a lot of apples, and we designed a plan to stop us having to buy in apples, basically, commercially sensible, but also in times of like pandemics and Brexit. Owning your own supply chain for your crops is a much more sustainable system, basically. Wood chip for propagation compost. So I probably spend, I don't know, 600 quid on propagation compost a year. We can make really good propagation compost, the stuff we grow all our seeds in, out of wood chip. We can produce wood chip from trees, so we included that in the system as well. So we wanted to produce the tree choice, had to fulfill our horticultural benefits, produce all our fruit trees, but also produce wood chip compost for us. Wildlife benefits. So I talked about this earlier, I'll rattle through this a bit. Yeah, I mean, it's not charitable, it's really important. Pictures here, kestrels, funny enough, kestrels don't actually eat rabbits, but rabbits aren't very good at identifying birds. So rabbits look at the sky and they just see a predator and they run away. If you have trees around your farming area, kestrels just come and sit in them and wait, looking for voles, looking for mice. But while they're there looking for voles and mice, the rabbits are looking at them from the hedge going, I'm not coming out there. And that in itself, like I said, we're not killing the rabbits, but they're managing the rabbit problem for me in a nice sort of passive way. Songbirds we talked about, they eat all the caterpillars. Well, not all of them, most of them. Ground beetles, slug predators, pollinators. So, you know, was it 80% of human food crops in Europe that Europeans eat? 80% are insect pollinated. So anything we can do to boost pollination numbers. But if you're a fruit and vegetable producer, this isn't charitable, this is a commercially critical behavior. Lacewings is the lovely little green insect in the middle and the bottom. They are a key predator of aphids. And they, like the ladybirds, they go and hide in the woods in the winter when the weather gets a bit on top. Hoverflies, another key predator of aphids. So like I said, wildlife managing is not charitable, it's a commercial behavior for me to grow better, higher yielding and better visually looking crops. We do loads of education on the farm. So right from tinies, so we've got a preschool nursery that all get dressed up in fluoro jackets and herded around like sheep around the farm. So we call them our smallest flock, but we take them from that age all the way through. So we do, we've got residential state school education set up, take kids out of London, come down. We thought we were going to teach them about farming. We actually just teach them about flies, mud, wasps, literally basic being in a natural environment stuff, which we've all realised is far more important because if they don't know about that, we'll leave farming until later. They just roll around in the mud. You see a lovely picture there, the kids in the puddles. I train a team of apprentices. We have a relationship with the Royal Agricultural University, which is the other side of town from us in Cirencester. We take their students and train them. And yeah, I mean, we want to engage the public wherever possible, do a lot of training. Trees are a fantastic tool for training, and it's a really good opportunity to teach people about agroforestry if we're doing it on the site ourselves. Visual impact, not to be underrated this. So those just behind the apple trees in that picture, you can see a couple of buildings. That is our farm shop and our cafe. The cafe looks out over the field where we've got the agroforestry. There's a few different mixed plant things there, but right in front of the cafe, which has got a big veranda where all the customers sit, is all the fruit trees, mostly apple trees. So whether it be the blossom in the spring, the fruit on the trees in the autumn, or just the structure of the bare trees in the winter, it's massively changed the view from the cafe. And it's got seasonal interest all year round. And then you've just got all the wildlife that comes in and sits in the trees as well. And I think they call it enriching the customer experience, is what the shop manager calls it. I'm assured. But I think it does. People love it, you know, and it just makes it more beautiful. For me as a worker, it makes my office is already very beautiful as a farmer. Adding all the trees into it just makes it even more beautiful. Choosing our trees. So like I said, they have to deliver on our aims. Our aims were many. They were horticultural benefits. They are boosting wildlife. I'm sure there's some others in there. There's lots of reasons. They must work on our soil type. So we're what's called Cotswold brash. We've got about 15 centimetres of soil. Then what looks like a dry stone wall underneath goes for about 15 foot. So we've got very, very little soil. It's very fertile, but it's very difficult to work with. Even the soil bit is very stony, basically. But as a farmer, I'll always take fertile soil over lovely physical soil because building fertility can be tricky. So it had to be high pH, had to deal with stony soil, and had to deal with shallow soil. They must fit with intended location. So for us, that's mixed horticultural cropping. It's a 5-year field scale rotation of field scale vegetable crops. We sourced funding for ours from the Woodland Trust. Woodland Trust stipulate that all the trees must be native trees, which, with my desire to slightly future-proof against climate change, was a little bit of a restricting thing for me. But hey, they paid for it all, so we planted native trees. Yeah, well, massively. HS2 is HS2, yeah, HS2 high-speed rail. What should have been a great high-speed rail project, which is getting smaller and smaller. They're planting Spanish provenance trees. So it's native, a lot of them are native, but they're sourced from Spain because they will be better suited to the climate in the next 20 years. It's quite interesting. Yeah, funny enough, there's so much more from them. We've also got lots of woodland. So, and a field where agroforestry has got woodland on 2 sides. We're not growing nut crops. If I was growing nut crops, I would definitely have a squirrel problem because they just hunt them out. For me, the biggest problems as far as protecting the trees are roe deer. Voles is the biggest one. And what the voles do is they live in tree guards. And in the winter, they build a nest in the tree guard. And they're so lazy, they can't be bothered to go and find any food. They sit in a little nest of grass in a tree, and like a beaver, just eat through the tree. And the first thing, absolute pain. So you can put all these trees to boost biodiversity, and they pay you back by eating your trees. But hey, yeah, that's the biggest one. Squirrels. I mean, it's a huge subject. I know lots of farmers are looking into it in a massive way. Riverford Organics are putting a lot of nut crops. I was went to an event there recently, and the only option, 2 options that I've heard so far. One is sterilisation, which the government are talking about doing, and then the other is shooting or trapping. Luckily, we don't have that problem. As a farmer, generally, I'm not a believer in killing pests. I'm growing in their area, so I protect my crops. That's my philosophy. So I would struggle. Maybe I'll never plant nuts because I don't have to deal with that problem, basically. Yeah, basically, natural predators is the main thing. And I don't know what the biggest predator of a squirrel would be, but Yeah, well, that would be the problem, wouldn't it? I suspect things like polecats, pine martins, stoats, those, well, not stoats and weasels are a bit little. I suspect they might be the predators of squirrels. But they're all in massive decline, or have been in massive decline. The polecats are just coming back up. But yeah, we're going to discuss that a bit more afterwards. It's a big subject, basically. Yeah. So apple production plan. The aim is to keep the shopping. We reckon we feed about it feels like we've got about a 200-person box scheme, which we always extrapolate out to be like about 800 individual people we're feeding. That's what the volumes sort of feel like. So we sell about 100 kilos of apples a week all year round, pretty much. But the UK apple growing season or harvesting season is basically August until mid-October, late October. And then there are storage varieties that you can store until March. So if you're going to produce and eat apples in the UK, your season is August to March, pretty much. So we need 100 kilos of apples a week. One tree at full maturity gives you 50 kilos of apples, but we are not a commercial orchard at all. In fact, the apples look after themselves. I prune them and I harvest them. I do a little bit of mulching and weeding here and there, but other than that, they're on their own a little bit. You know, my main focus is vegetable crops. And the apples, yeah, they're pretty tough. They look after themselves. But because I'm not mollycoddling them and spending every day looking after them, I'm not expecting full commercial yield. So we've knocked 25% off that average 50 kilo yield, just from being a low input system and them just looking after themselves. Supply period of 37 weeks. So we needed about 3.7 tons of apples. That was basically 98 trees. And we realized that storage was going to be a big part of the challenge. That's the plan we came up with. It's a little for everyone to see, but I can always share it. I'm going to share, hang on, I can share this. You can share it with the whole group afterwards, the presentation. But yeah, we have 13 different varieties, some for picking fresh through the growing season, and then quite a lot of emphasis on storage varieties to take us from like mid-October all the way through to March. And then, so that's the apple trees. Hardwood tree selection. So we wanted to produce wood chip. If you want to produce wood chip, the best thing to do is to grow what they're called coppice trees. So these are trees that you grow for about 5 years, and then you cut them down to the ground, and then they grow back again. Every time they grow back with more stems. And every 5 years, we'll cut these trees down, put them into a wood chipper, make wood chip with it, and then you compost that wood chip for 2 years, and you get the most amazing compost. And we're not starting to harvest our trees yet, but from other wood chip on the farm, we've got big forestry on the farm as well. We are now starting to become self-sufficient in our own wood chip compost. And that's especially important at the moment where we talk about all of horticulture trying to move away from peat in compost. For me, it's endless discussions about what we're going to do without peat. It's simple. Wood chip's fantastic. I'm not, there's so many farmers using it now. I'm not quite sure why there's still a debate going on about it. Wood chip's just the answer. It's absolutely fantastic stuff and very sustainable. As far as coppicing, all hardwood trees will coppice. You can cut all hardwood trees down and they'll grow back multi-stemmed. However, they all do it at different speeds. A willow will grow back to 5 meters high, a mature willow, in about a year to 2 years, depending on the variety. Hazel and alder will do it in about 5 years. Sweet chestnut will do it in about 8 years. Oak will do it in about 20 years. We've got a 5-year rotation in the veg. So we wanted something that we could harvest every 5 years as we went round our rotation. So hazel, ideally 7 years, alder's 5 years. So we just sort of bunch the hazel and the alder, and we're going to cut them every 5 years, basically. So that's the wood chip production. And then for biodiversity, we just went with a succession of blossom. Reason for that is pollen produced by blossom is a very, very important source of protein for insects. So insects, obviously bees collect pollen and nectar. Loads of insects don't collect it, but they eat it. And it's their source of protein. And it's the protein that allows the insects, the hoverflies and the lacewings, they'll eat the protein out of the blossom, and they'll then fly out across the crops, hunt out the aphids and eat them. So if you can keep pollen around your crops for as long a season as possible, the insects will hang around and protect your crops for you as well. So we've got in order, it goes, pussy willow starts flowering in February, Then we go into the cherries. I've got white willow. Then we go into wild cherries. Then all the apples start blossoming. And then the last trees to blossom for us, we chose elder, which we can crop the flowers off and make things with, and the berries off and make things with. Primarily, it's there as a wildlife tree because it's a late flowerer and a prolific flowerer. And then spindle as well is also a very late flowerer, so we put that in too. How are we doing on time, Alan? Yeah. Considerations for layout of the plantings. I talked about this before, but just our take on it. So we went aspect, we went north to south for maximum sunlight to our crops. Rotation, we went for the alley cropping thing. So we sort of bordered all of our rotation areas with lines of trees. Windbreak effect. So a tree will create a windbreak effect 10 times its height. Our trees are all going to get to around about 5 meters tall, roughly, as an average. So that will give us 50 meters of windbreak effect. So we've actually spaced some of our tree lines out by 50 meters because that's the maximum effect of the windbreak effect. It also happens to be the maximum range of predatory insects from a vibrant habitat. So they meet up quite nicely. So where we've got insect habitats and windbreaks, they're both working off the same distances, which is good. Maths governing the layout. So this is the systems thing. So I was already growing vegetable crops in the field. I grow them on 1.5 meter wide beds. I water them with a 16 meter wide boom that's 100 meters long, and I have crop meshes to put on my crops that are 100 meters long. So that is the maths that governed the whole layout. So that there's no awkward bits that the mesh didn't fit on or the irrigator wouldn't fit down or anything like that. It was all planned out around my existing mathematical system. Irrigation is absolutely crucial. Luckily, if you're a horticultural operation, you tend to be quite good on irrigation already because vegetables need irrigation. But if you're planting trees, first 3 years after planting, you want to make sure you're able to get water on those trees. I suspect anyone who planted a lot of trees in the spring just gone, I have to say, probably lost a fair few trees this year because the drought was pretty severe and one of them came fairly early as well. In fact, it was a very dry spring as well. So yeah, it's really important to be able to irrigate your trees. It's important to remember that when you plant a small little apple tree in a hole this big, so remember that that tree is going to become quite big, quite wide, and its roots going to go out quite wide. So when we planted our first tree lines, if I'll show you a slide on this next, I'll show you in a sec. Understory. So either side of your trees, you've got your vegetable crops as an understory, but directly below the trees, you need to decide what you want to do with the ground underneath the trees. There's various options. You can put more crops in underneath the trees. So people often put rhubarb in or soft fruit canes in there or soft fruit bushes in there, which like growing in the shade. Strawberries do all right in the shade under the trees as well. They're a woodland plant. The other one, lots of people do cut flower crops, especially bulb crops, which come out flower for you to pick before the trees come out in the leaf. So you're making good, positive use of the shade and lack of shade. For us, and I'll show you in a minute, we just went for perennial wildflowers because managing insects in vegetable crops is such an important thing that any way I can boost predatory insects around my crops, I grab that opportunity. Irrigation. So there you go. That's our irrigation boom coming down the field over our brassica crops this year. If you look at the left-hand side of the picture there, you can see the tree line down the left-hand side of the picture. And that boom, we've got a tap in the end of the boom, which we can open up when it's near the trees. And as we're watering the vegetable crops, it just goes down, watering all the trees at the same time. So I mean, you could do that with a line, a drip line, but just make sure you've got it before you plant the trees, or it's there ready to go, because the droughts are going to become much, much more regular. Once you get the trees away, once you pass year 3, they'll survive most weather conditions, really. They might get knocked back by a severe drought, but they won't die. It takes a lot to kill a tree in a drought. Increasing spread of trees. Okay, so when we planted our trees to start with, they're in a bed 1.5 meters wide, and we grew veg right up to either side of them. And then with each year that's gone past, we've allowed the bed next to trees to widen out to accommodate their roots and the spread of their branches. So we started off with a 1.5 metre bed for the trees. We're now on a 4.5 metre bed for the trees. So it's just important to take that into account when you're planning the layout of your field in the first place. Understory. So this is what we have underneath our trees. So it's just perennial wildflower mix, and that'll start flowering in, I don't know, like April, and that'll flower right through to sort of mid-August, pretty much. And again, it's beautiful and it's absolutely vibrant, untouched, permanent habitat for all those things I talked about: beetles, lacewings, ladybirds, all those things. Yeah, it's cool. I reckon I'm 5 off. That's fine. So that's what one rotation area looks like for us. So the green lines on the top and the bottom of the screen, that is the agroforestry strips. The white area are the veg strips, and then the yellow lines there. We were thinking about them being tree strips, but the owner of the land got a little bit worried about the amount of trees that potentially were going in. So for the moment, we've kept the trees 50 metres apart. We might plant into the yellow strips, but at the moment, those yellow strips are playing a different role, and that is we use them as wildflower strips. So that's up the middle of our squash crop this year. And obviously for our squash crop, that brings in loads of predatory insects, manage aphids and things like that. But with the squash crop, that brings in loads of pollinators and gives us really good pollination on our squash crops. So, but they are possibly tree lines in waiting, if I persuade my boss. That's how we laid out the trees. So we had an apple tree with their big trees. They want space underneath them. So 5 metre gap either side of the apple trees. And then we went coppice tree, wildlife tree, coppice tree, wildlife tree, coppice tree, wildlife tree. So even when we coppice the trees, there will still be wildlife benefit there. There will still be windbreak there all the time. It'll be a little bit less windbreak because we've coppiced some of the trees, but we never cut the whole lot down at all. That's the layout of the whole field. So on the left-hand side, that's the cap in the shop. You can see that view straight over the field. We've got a few different layouts. So we've got a closer layout of apple trees right next to the cafe, and they are 16 metres apart. And in the wider field, they're 50 metres apart. So a few sort of different designs in the same field. I'm going to skip that. Phasing, that is about matching rotation to harvesting, but I think on time, we'll skip. Protecting trees. So like I said, deer, rabbits and voles were our biggest problems. So we used tree tubes on hardwood trees, and we made our own fence guards just out of we recycled old sheep fencing and made guards around the apple trees just to keep the deer away. And then long term, we pruned our apple trees up quite high before they start cropping. And basically our main deer around here is around the farm is roe deer. Roe deer do not like to stick their heads in the air to eat, I found out. They only like to stick their heads down to eat. So if you can just, a roe deer is about that high, you can make sure your first apples are about there. They don't like eating them, basically. So that's what we're aiming to do with pruning. And then, I think we're on. Yeah, other considerations, weed control. So definitely the first 3-4 years with hardwoods, lots of wood chip mulch, just suppress the weeds immediately around the tree for the first 3 or 4 years. Mulching them will deal with the weeds, but it will also lock in moisture. Absolutely crucial, like we were talking about. Pruning, quiet time in veg circles. So again, do all my tree work, mulch stuff, prune the apple trees, replace broken guards, prune off any damaged branches. Irrigation, I've gone on about enough. Oh, yeah. Cool. No, that's all right. I have 2 slides left. So we put up a big glass house once the pandemic started. It was actually a reaction to Brexit and try and bring in more of our imported food supply in-house. Obviously, inside a glass house, wind is not a problem. It's lovely, it's totally still all the time in there. However, heat and sunlight are a problem. So actually, we've started planting peach trees inside. Like I said, I wouldn't grow peaches outside because you get late frosts. We bring them inside the glass house, they don't get frosts, but critically inside the glass house, they cast shade. So when we get really hot in the glass house in the summer, the height of summer, having that dapple shade around would just drop those temperatures a little bit, which will help. Again, tomatoes, for example, they perform best at around about 25 degrees centigrade. Once you go over 30 degrees centigrade, tomato performance drops. They like the hot weather, but they don't like it that hot, basically. And then I think the last one is just me done. So thank you very much for listening. Cool. Okay. I'll repeat because I repeat the question. Yeah.
So, one of the comments is that about the squirrels, that Monica basically has to have a squirrel.
Squirrels take your apples. Crikey, I haven't got that coming. Not yet. I mean, what's interesting about that is I'd always say is like, it's really interesting what like this what we noticed this year was we were getting totally different damage in our vegetable crops because wildlife was really thirsty because there was no water anywhere. So we were getting damage we've never had before, and on crops we've never had before. And what it was all the wild, there was no water anywhere for wildlife to drink. So they were using our crops as a water source, especially birds. Birds, a lot of the green leafy crops getting damaged. So with squirrels and apples, it's interesting. We have no problem with squirrels and apples, but our hedges are packed with hazels. So there's so much other food there for them. And we tend to find with other damage on crops, so pigeon damage on cabbage crops for us, we only get that in the spring. We only get it when we plant out the first crops. Once the field is full of cabbages, they eat a little bit, but not that much. It's when you as the farmer are providing the only food source for 600 acres, it's going to get eaten. So possibly, my thing is always to bring as much plant diversity to my cropping areas as possible, possibly other food sources. So if you want to protect your apples, maybe plant a load of hazels, not for cropping, but to keep the squirrels away, possibly.
And then just quickly here so one question was, do you add compost wood chip? Did you add anything to wood chip compost, and how long did you make that compost?
So the wood chip compost, I have two different kinds of compost. I have what I call my general purpose compost, and that is wood chip and just waste veg that comes back, waste from preparing vegetables. But we mix all our waste veg, mix the wood chip, and that takes it takes about a year and a half to make that into compost that I lay on the surface of my vegetable beds. And then there's another compost we make, which is just pure wood chip, so nothing else, composted for 2 years, and then we just use that for propagation. And then most of my fertility management on the farm I do with cover crops, not with compost. We use most of the compost we make, we use in the glass house and in the polytunnels. Outside, everything, all the fertility is managed with clovers and other cover crops, basically. So as far as growing it in the compost, we put the compost on the ground and then we plant through the compost into the soil, basically. The only stuff that would actually grow in compost would be the young plug plants, so 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the plant variety.
Are there any other questions either from the room or online?
Just a quick one. A big one, I don't know. Just because it's such a different way of thinking about farming, that kind of systems approach, it's quite sophisticated. Presumably farmers operate in the UK, but I guess my question is, are you hopeful about that being taken on? Because obviously, is there a lot of resistance to doing things like that? Through policy, it's kind of coming through in a
I've been involved in a lot of the trial work for the new subsidies scheme. I've been involved in a lot of the stuff for the agroforestry. It's right up there. Yeah. Loads of money.
And they're getting it.
Yeah, they I have to say, the new agricultural subsidies scheme, I like it. I think it's good. A lot of farmers who don't like it because there's not enough emphasis on food production, but as an organic farmer, it's dreamy. If we can feed everyone, but we've destroyed planet Earth, what's the point? We have to do them side by side. And the new subsidy system coming in has a massive emphasis on planet health, huge. And as a part of that, agroforestry is being massively championed. And interestingly, from what you said, one of the biggest challenges is knowledge. So there's a lot of work going in at the moment about how that knowledge is going to be disseminated, whether it's going to be a government-led education process to encourage and teach farmers how to integrate trees onto their farms. Yeah.
And I guess it's that point you made about it not being the charitable thing, actually getting people to understand that it's a commercial imperative, and the bonus is that you get great outcomes for the planet as well, right?
Yeah, and interestingly, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. And as an example, so where, I don't know, 10 years ago, if you talk to a UK farm about agroforestry, most of them wouldn't have heard of it. If they'd heard of it, they'd think it was a bit of a niche thing, and what, you know, it would just be like, yeah, whatever, kind of thing. Now, with the flooding, the winds, climate change, like I said, it's now not a charitable thing or a quirky, different way of producing food. And that's why I sing out this, you know, I talk about it loud and proud, that they are an amazing tool for all these things that we're, as farmers, we're having to battle with on a daily basis with climate change. And I think everyone's just realizing that, you know, and I think there's obviously been people shouting about agroforestry for years and years, and suddenly everyone's listening to them. And I think the government are backing it up, and I think a lot of farmers are interested. Definitely, when I go and speak at other agroforestry events, they're packed out, and they're packed out with conventional farmers, not with people who are already kind of like sustainably minded and maybe looking at other alternative forms of agro. They're packed out with huge 10,000 acre arable farms are there, which is great. It's great. It's exciting. Yeah.
We got any other questions?
Cool. Good. I hope it's. Oh yeah. It's going to be a nice wide brushstroke. I hope I managed to get lots in there, and yeah, it's informative. Yeah. Yeah. It's an exciting thing. And I'm not going to say if, when you get your farm, it's such an exciting process. You know, I love, one of my favorite times of the year is crop planning. You know, it's like my big cunning plan for the year. And I sit down and I scheme for 2 weeks. And it's designing agroforestry systems or whole farms is so much more exciting. You're designing the future, essentially, and a future that lasts a long time. Trees and farms. Yeah. So yeah.
Do you see if anyone's got their hand up?
I can't possibly. No, I can't see anyone with a hand up.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone, any other questions for Andy? If not, then I think what we would like to say is a really huge thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'm not allowed to talk about this at home in front of my wife and kids, so it's really nice to have an audience who's interested.
And I think, what we would like you were talking a lot about the design, and I think basically, can you please come and help us design?
I'd love to. I absolutely love to. I love. What I like to do in that situation is I'd like to come up and assist you to design it. Yeah, more importantly, because you have to take ownership of these things yourself. Yeah. So, and then you really understand them. So yeah. I would definitely be able to do that. Yeah. Brilliant. Cool.
And we talked about visiting Andy's farm, because there is nothing like seeing it.
Yeah. And interesting, the thing that after reading up much more about the plans to farm, there are so many other parallels other than agroforestry about the farm. It'd be great to come and have a look at. Just that whole trying to do everything on one farm. Yeah. And which we're passionate about. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a little visit.
What's really interesting actually though is just the fact that we have this farm which produces a whole crop, that's and everything is just coming back to the fact that we multi-crop with animal management.
Yeah.
Everything happens to you creating that whole system farm.
The most common response to any problem anyone asks me about farms or growing or anything, the quickest response always is diversity. Mm-hmm. It's the sustainable and the resilience of diversity of business. So on our farm, you know, it sounds like we've got everything: education, dairy, holiday cottages, camping, all these things. When it's a terrible farming year, it's the other diverse parts of the business that keep us surviving. You know, when it's lockdown and all the hospitality shut down and the cafe shut down, it was the farming that kept the business alive. And then with crops as well, and with your crops on the farm, whether it's, you want a bit of everything. There's weather that kills all the vegetables and doesn't kill the cows. There's weather that kills all the cows and doesn't kill all the vegetables. So you've got them all on your farm, you're ready for anything. Yeah.